From Boy to the Joshua Tree to Achtung Baby and beyond, we explore 50 years of U2 with author Bradley Morgan. Next on Booked on Rock.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. We have a returning guest, Bradley Morgan, back on the show. His latest book is titled U2, Until the End of the World. Bradley, great to see you again.
Thanks so much for having me, Eric. It's really wonderful to be back.
Weldon Owen, the publishers, did a fantastic job laying out this book. You got to be psyched.
It really looks beautiful. I mean, the hardcover is fantastic. The photos are bright, crisp, and colorful and clear, and they really did a great job with the layout.
Yeah, and you tell the story of U2 throughout 50 years. The first chapter titled Another Time, Another Place, with the quote, drummer seeks musicians to form band. According to the book, actually, we're just over 49 years from the exact day that the band came together for the first time. We're recording this on October 2nd. It was September 26th of 1976. Band not called U2 right away, and there was a fifth member early on. If you could take us back to the origins of U2.
So it's 1976 in Dublin, and it was Larry Mullen Jr., the drummer of U2, who had posted up that notice up at his school, Mount Temple Comprehensive School, and it's where all the members went to U2. All the members of U2 went to school there as teenagers. Bono back then was Paul Hewson, The Edge was David Evans, and then you had Adam Clayton to kind of round things out. And they weren't called U2 at first. When they initially formed, they were Feedback because that was really the only musical term they knew, and then they called themselves The Hype. And the name U2 actually came from Steve Averill, who went by Steve Rapid. He was a member of the punk group Radiators from Space, and it was because the graphic of a letter and a number looked really pleasing on a poster, and as he became on to do all of U2's album covers and even become a great graphic designer outside of U2, that was a very apt thing for him to put together. And you're right. There was a fifth member at the beginning, Dick Evans, who was The Edge's older brother. And it was on that date you mentioned, September 26, 1976, that they first played together. And they all fitted really tightly into the kitchen of Larry's house, playing whatever covers of bands they liked at the time, T-Rex, the Rolling Stones, Bay City Rollers. And during that kitchen rehearsal, they were also joined by Ivan McCormick, who was the younger brother of Neil McCormick, one of their friends who would later become the music critic for the Daily Telegraph. But Ivan wouldn't last long, and neither would Dick, because he was a few years older and already in college, while the others were still in high school. And, at that age, you're really worlds apart at just a few years. And so he had his own rhythm, his own pace at that point, and didn't quite mesh with the core unit that would develop of Adam, Larry, David, and Paul, Adam, Larry, Bono, and Edge.
There was a rehearsal space in the early days called the Yellow House, where the band was called Feedback at the time, met every Saturday. A small cottage in the same graveyard where Bono's mother was buried. How young was Bono when his mother died, and how would that affect him as a person, as an artist in the years to come?
It really is such a sad story. So Bono was 14 when his mother, named Iris Hewson, passed away, and that is already a difficult thing, especially for a child. But what makes it even more tragic was how it happened. Iris had suffered a brain aneurysm while the family was attending the funeral for her father, so Bono's grandfather. And she had collapsed right in the middle of it. I think she perhaps collapsed as his casket was being lowered, but I'm not exactly too sure. And Bono recalls this in his memoir, Surrender, and just talking about the experience of seeing her being taken away. And I think it was like seeing like snooker balls parting, just watching his mother being carried through the crowd. And he turned to music to help deal with that. And, with someone who has been performing as long as Bono has, you kind of assume it's something he's always done, but, you think he was a singer from the very beginning and that he was encouraged to pursue that. But when Iris was alive, Bono had no musical ambitions, and his mother certainly didn't see anything musical within him. But however, he needed a place to channel his grief and anger because his home growing up without his mother, just being him, his dad, and his brother, it was a place of concentrated male rage where the topic of Iris's passing was just never discussed. And it's something that has been with him that entire time because he was an emotionally fragile teenager who needed music to process that grief. And his mother became a topic in several songs within U2's catalog. And it's even something he revisits, not just in his memoir Surrender, but also in the that stage show that he did, Stories of Surrender, in kind of recalling that and recalling what his relationship was with his father growing up in that house without her.
And they signed a contract with Island Records during March of 1980, and they promised a debut within the first year, and that would be the album Boy, which features the single I Will Follow. It's the only song U2 has performed on every tour. What is the song about? And also, can you talk about why it's such an important song for the band?
I Will Follow is also the track that opens the album Boy, and I think that's a very bold move because it's one of those songs where Bono is processing his grief over losing his mother. It's a song about unconditional love that a mother has for a child and him wrestling with no longer having that. And it's something that he desires so much in the song that the lyrics are about a young boy following his mother into the grave. And that is, that's tragic to think about when, to think of a child wanting to, you follow your mother all your life, your hand is holding her hand, she leads the way. And when she's no longer there, his instinct is to follow her into that place that he can't go. And he's left alone with that.
You're right, quote, Boy had been recorded in little over a month with sessions finishing in September 1980 and would be the quickest U2 would ever record an album. Reached number 52 in the UK, 63 in the US, a solid opening. They followed that with 1981's October, which has Fire and Gloria. The Edge assumed the band would work quickly to develop new ideas for songs after touring and building up confidence off of that, but that wasn't so. Making matters worse was an incident in March of 1981 involving a briefcase. What was in that briefcase and what happened to it?
Yeah, so U2 were working on a really tight deadline with touring. They weren't really making headway in the UK, so their key to success early on was trying to play these American markets, and it was really tight schedule, doing all these shows and trying to make what would become that second album, October. And so it was a time where a lot of things were just happening really fast. And during a gig in Portland, Bono had a briefcase that was stolen from the band's green room, presumably by a couple of women who came and visited during the show. And this briefcase, among other things like his work visa and letters from Allie, who was his then girlfriend and would become his future wife, this briefcase contained the lyrics and song ideas for what would become October. And naturally, this was an incredibly disruptive thing, and Bono had to rewrite a lot of that material from memory. And you can hear this on October because some of the songs sound a little unfinished and more rougher than when you listen to Boy. Go and listen to Boy and October back to back. There is a lot of thematic overlap and even a lot of sonic overlap because they had to make it very quickly and with less time to get these song ideas together. And even then, Bono wasn't much of a songwriter. He talks about songwriting as sketching, just him putting, words to music because they didn't think that lyrics were necessarily so important. And it was an experience that really left an impact on Bono. Whenever the band would play Portland, he would bring up the briefcase hoping someone would return it, which is what happened 23 years later in 2004. A woman in Tacoma, Washington named Cindy Harris, she had that briefcase in her attic, but didn't know that it was stolen. And so she had made arrangements to give it back to Bono. And there's a story of this. You can read about this in a book of edited essay collections called Exploring U2, edited by Scott Calhoun. And there actually is a story from the person who returned it telling that. It's a really interesting story.
Staying with October, you're right, quote, U2's religious convictions can be heard throughout October. It was religion that almost broke up the band early on.
Right, because three of the members of the band, Bono, Edge, and Larry, were members of an evangelical Christian group called the Shalom Fellowship. Adam was not a member of that. He was not a particularly religious person. And this fellowship was really strict about the proper way to be a Christian. They felt that you had to, in order to be a good Christian, had to really dedicate yourselves to their following and their teachings. And the fellowship kept telling the band that they couldn't be both in a rock group and a faithful follower of Christ at the same time. They had to choose one or the other. And that decision almost tore the band apart. Certainly, the Edge was having a crisis of confidence and told Bono that he was thinking about leaving the band over it. And Bono wanted to support his friend, and because if the Edge wasn't going to be in U2, then neither was he. And he tells this story in Surrender where he recalls that when they went to tell their manager, Paul McGuinness, about quitting the band, Paul McGuinness had told them to ask God whether it was acceptable for them to break a legal contract. So basically, U2 kept from breaking up because they didn't want to upset God by not fulfilling their contractual obligations. Like, oh, God would, be upset if we broke our promise. And I don't want to belittle that kind of crisis of confidence that they had, because growing up in Ireland at that time, a very religious country, and them being a part of that environment, I mean, I think it's a struggle that every young person has in terms of trying to navigate their faith and what that means. And they were able to, at that time and over the years since, kind of process how to juggle being in a band and being a good Christian at the same time. There's a lot of people going to tell you what you should and shouldn't do, and they were impressionable young men, and I think to the benefit of all of their fans, I'm glad they stuck together.
Yeah, they were barely into their 20s, I think, at that time.
Oh, just teenagers.
My first U2 memories come from the third album, War. New Year's Day, the video was on all the time. Two Hearts Beat as One, Sunday Bloody Sunday. Those are the two other singles. MTV played Sunday Bloody Sunday, the live version, all the time. Steve Lillywhite, he returned for his third producer credit, but you read about how Bono had considered using a different producer for each song to vary the album's sonic flow. It didn't happen. There would be a producer change on the next album, but talk about War. This was the band's first career-defining album, and it continues to resonate today.
Bono did have the idea that every song would be produced by a different producer. That's the kind of break their stride of what they had been doing with Boy in October. And even on War, there is a track that's not produced by Steve Lillywhite. It's The Refugee. And if you listen to it, it's a very new wave sounding. I really like that track, but a lot of U2 fans don't because it sounds so new wave. But War is really the album that gave U2 their breakthrough. The UK music press wasn't paying much attention to them because they were from Ireland, and which is why they toured their first two albums mostly in America. And it was America where they really found their audience. And those singles from the album that you mentioned, Sunday Bloody Sunday and New Year's Day, were getting a lot of play on college radio, which certainly helped the album. But when they released their first concert video in support of the War album, which was Under a Blood Red Sky, that was recorded at the Red Rocks Amphitheater in Colorado, that's where they became a sensation, because clips from that video then became heavy rotation MTV, which you saw when you were younger. I mean, it has that performance where Bono's waving that white flag. It really became their first iconic performance, and just that symbol with him and that white flag, it's something that continues to endure in their legacy. Having seen U2 perform at the Sphere in Las Vegas in 2023, I mean, that white flag appears in some form, in that. So it's something that still they carry with them after all this time.
Chapter 2 is titled In God's Country. It leads with, quote, "The start of 1984 signaled a change in U2's sound. The Unforgettable Fire from 1984. It has Pride in the Name of Love, co-produced by the team of Daniel Lanois and Brian Eno. What was U2's reason for wanting that sound change?"
Well, it was after finishing War. The band felt they really had done everything they could with that harder rock post-punk sound, and they felt they had taken it as far as they could go. I mean, if they probably continued with that sound, they likely would not have survived as a band. And even when we think of bands from that time who kind of maintain a consistent sound, they're still kind of resting on their laurels, for a lot of them. And for them, making another album with the same sonic aesthetic would just be too repetitive. And I'm sure it was not an easy decision to move on from that, especially with the success they were now experiencing with War and Under a Blood Red Sky. There's that saying, if it's not broke, then don't fix it. But they wanted to move on to something else, and I think that's a very important thing for artists to do.
The dynamic between the band and the producers at the start of recording is fascinating. Bono's quoted in the book about that period. He said, quote, "With Eno, we discovered the spirit of our music and a confidence in ourselves. The emphasis was on the moment in recording, on the spontaneity." And Bono usually came in with rough lyrics, and needed to be constantly singing in order to finish the song. That seemed to be tough for the band, but Lanois and Eno, they liked that approach, right?
Absolutely. Eno is very much a believer in experimentation and trying new things, which is precisely why they wanted to work with him. And Eno had been integral to other artists who were in transitional periods, like Bowie during his Berlin years. And you two were big fans of Bowie, and they were big fans of Roxy music that Eno was a part of. Eno also produced Peter Gabriel, who they were fans of. And you have to remember that you two, despite being their fourth album, were still fairly young and learning themselves. They had limited experience when they formed. They taught themselves to be a rock band and then decided to essentially start over with this new sonic identity. So there's certainly growing pains to be had with that sort of thing. But when you surround yourself with smart and talented people who can shepherd you through that, you can get a lot of success. And Eno was the right person for them at the right time. And I've heard this joke from critics of U2's music that if you happen to be a fan of U2's music, it's only because you're really a fan of Brian Eno.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Well, we're waiting.
Bradley Morgan, the author of U2 Until the End of the World, their appearance at Live Aid, that sealed the deal. U2 had arrived globally with their set, which was the band's closer for the Unforgettable Fire tour. And it sets up an even bigger album with Joshua Tree. Unforgettable Fire reached number 1 in the UK, 12 in the US, but with Joshua Tree, number 1 in 8 countries, including the US, multiple smash hit singles, With or Without You, I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For, Where the Streets Have No Name, and it won Album of the Year at the Grammys. You wrote an entire book on this album, 2021's U2's The Joshua Tree, Planting Roots in Mythic America, and you were on the show to talk about that book so people can find it. Talk about how U2's experiences and understanding of America would directly impact the songwriting on The Joshua Tree.
So you two, as young lads growing up in Ireland, they had this particular image of America. To them, America was a sort of promised land because it had historically been a refuge for the Irish to escape famine and violence. And at the time when they were growing up in the 70s, Ireland was going through a period of rapid development, small towns being concentrated into cities and to to tower buildings. And there was a lot of economic problems. There was a lot of drug problems, other social problems. And so this became sort of a mythic idea for them, America. But it was while touring America that they realized that there was a lot more to the country than they had realized, that we as Americans have our own economic and social and political problems that further marginalize the non-powerful, specifically like women and people of color. And this idea specifically came from observing Ronald Reagan's presidency and the impact that was having on Americans and people all around the world, whether it be his economic policy, labeled as Reaganomics, or the military interventions in El Salvador and Nicaragua. And this had a profound impact on them. The Edge has even said that they didn't understand their own Irishness until they came to America. But however, instead of becoming cynical about that, they wanted to express, the full entirety of their feelings about America, like the full America through music. And that while there were a lot of problems that they saw, there was a lot of beauty, especially with the landscape, the music, the culture. And they really wanted to elevate and raise this idea that you could admonish something that you love, that you can criticize something that you love. And the album that would become The Joshua Tree was going to reflect that because it was originally going to be called The Two Americas. And the idea was going to represent the dichotomy of life in America, this promised land concept versus the reality dynamic that they had realized while they were touring.
And before they reinvented their sound with Achtung Baby, there was the release of 1988's Rattle and Hum, which is a live studio album, a live/studio album with a companion film. Jimmy Iovine brought in to produce the album. Desire, Angel of Harlem, When Love Comes to Town, All I Want Is You, they all come from this album. It reached number 1 in the UK, number 3 in the US. You write in the book, quote, despite the success of The Joshua Tree and its ensuing tour, U2 were unable to earn the acclaim their first film, Under a Blood Red Sky, had achieved. Though it became the highest grossing documentary at the time of its release, the film was much maligned by the press. So what were the criticisms, and how do you feel about the album and the film?
The Joshua Tree was U2's way of commenting on America and what that meant to them as young men from Ireland. And U2 has historically had this issue as a band, throughout their career, and Rattle and Hum is certainly the first example of this, where they have this issue that once they have an idea they like and works in them, they really push it as far as they can go. So they continued this with Rattle and Hum, but more in a way that really drew out the influence that roots in American blues music was having them at the time. And essentially, they were trying to sell American music back to Americans, but through their own lenses. And audiences just weren't having it. They knew that music, they knew that sound, they grew up with it. U2 was excited saying, look what we discovered, look how this is influencing us, but Americans had already seen it. And U2 had only been releasing music for about 8 years at that point, but now here they were covering the Beatles and Bob Dylan, playing with B.B. King, and this left some audiences thinking that U2 were placing themselves higher in the cultural hierarchy than many believed they should have at that time, and precisely because they were still relatively new and not the rock and roll Hall of Famers we know today. You were asking me, what would have happened if they would have continued doing that war sound? Maybe it would have resulted in a similar kind of backlash that Rattle and Hum experienced. And as a result, they started to become a bloated show band. Bono talks about this in the documentary From the Sky Down about creating Achtung Baby and the journey from Rattle and Hum to Achtung Baby. And audiences back home in Ireland, he said, felt that they were becoming less Irish and more American, almost becoming caricatures. And that was having an effect on the band that made them question what they were doing. And as far as my own feelings about the documentary, I've seen it a few times. I watched it twice for writing this book, and it has its entertaining moments. Certainly, there's this performance of Where the Streets Have No Name that's an absolute highlight, and it's worth checking out on YouTube.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really cool from Arizona. But also, I was a year old when the film came out, so its legacy was already in the milieu of U2's history, and I was aware of it by the time I'd seen it. So it's a cultural document that I appreciate, but it's not something that I return to often. With anything with U2, I always gravitate to the music more than I do the video stuff, and there's some really interesting things on that album. Certainly, the performance, so I still haven't found what I'm looking for with the New Voices of Freedom Gospel Choir
yeah.
is an absolute highlight of that. And there's some interesting tracks on there. Heartland is kind of a Joshua Tree-esque thing that's not as good, but it's still interesting. Dylan plays and performs on Love Rescue Me. Desire's a cool single. There are some, little. It's an uneven album, but it's a pretty good one.
Uneven is the word I was thinking. Yeah. 1991's Achtung Baby, released November 1991, another massive hit album with 5 singles: The Fly, The Top 10 Mysterious Ways, and one, The Top 40 Even Better Than the Real Thing, and Who's Gonna Ride Your Wild Horses. A reinvention of U2, a risk. It paid off. How did the critical backlash that U2 received at the close of the 80s influence this album?
So after Rattle and Hum, there was a lot of debate in the band about what direction to go in musically, and there is a New Year's Eve performance where Bono says, maybe it's not New Year's Eve, maybe it's actually like December 30th, where he tells the audience that we're going to go back and dream it all up again. And a new decade was dawning, and a lot of walls were coming down, revealing new ideas. Like quite literally, the Berlin Wall fell during November 1989, and at the same time, there was all this exciting electronic music coming out of Germany and the rest of Europe that was bright, colorful, and really signaled like the future possibilities of culture and technology and art. And U2, having done everything they could with America as a musical theme, were now setting their sights on Europe and helping figure out their future. Essentially, kind of a return to home, essentially.
Tensions within any band is expected at some point. But I guess it surprised me with U2 because they seemed like they all got along great. But at this time, there's a lot of dissension, a lot of fights internally. Bono and Daniel Lanois almost fought. Adam Clayton had a moment with Bono in the studio. You read about he handed Bono his bass and basically said, "You think you know how to do it? You go ahead and play." So things were getting tense. They were pretty close to breaking up during those recording sessions?
That's right. Things were becoming really tense, and the band was close to breaking up over creative differences. Bono and the Edge wanted to explore a more experimental sound based on the electronic music that they were discovering at that time. Bands like KMFDM and the Young Gods, while Adam and Larry wanted to stay rooted in rock and roll. When they were growing up in Ireland in the 70s, they were kind of limited in what music was available to them. And so there's a lot of bands that maybe we take for granted that, they were just hearing and discovering for the first time and trying to figure out how that kind of fits with the core of what they were doing. And it's already difficult enough to figure out and understand what you want when you're unsure of yourself in your own direction. I'm sure each one of them, every single one of them, wasn't confident about the future of U2, but not only to figure that out for yourself, but have to factor in the same thing from three other people, all of them trying to understand themselves just as much you are with yourself, it can create a lot of tension and frustration. But it was the big breakthrough, breakthrough that got the band through that was the song One. It came out of a jam, and they kind of formulated the song together. They found it, and it was really what saved them and moved them through finishing the album.
And for those who are curious, there are songs that they were working on that they put aside that they had started recording, and they're on YouTube. You can find them, right? They're demos, they're versions, like totally separate songs, along with songs that kind of morph into what we hear on Achtung Baby, I believe, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, there's a big set that came out for their 20th anniversary that has all that, and I think you can even stream
Yeah, so it's on the deluxe edition.
the deluxe edition, and actually you can stream a lot of that material for the 30th anniversary on all the streaming services. The one thing that 30th anniversary doesn't have that 20th does is there's that kindergarten set. So it's a whole CD of like early demo. It's the entire Achtung Baby album, but like the early versions of those songs. And so you can hear those kind of early demos, and you can even hear not demos, but final products of new music that they were making. They had made a score to a stage adaptation of A Clockwork Orange by Anthony DeBurgess, and that is kind of like got a funky electronic vibe as well. So even before Achtung Baby, you got a sense of what direction they were going in. They also contributed a cover of a Cole Porter song for that Red Hot and Blue album that was to benefit the AIDS crisis, and that's got like a dark electronic vibe as well, and that precedes Achtung Baby.
And there were two different recording locations, right?
Yep, they were recorded in Hansa Studios in Berlin, where Bowie had worked back in the 70s. It used to be a Weimar era like ballroom, and then it became a recording studio. And then I think they finished it up in Ireland.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
I mean, there's like no way that we can just pause for a minute. You guys just go home and do your stuff, and then tomorrow we can just like continue.
Hey guys, thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock Podcast. If you've just found the podcast, welcome. If you've been listening, thank you so much for your support. And make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and let people know about Booked on Rock. And if you do like the podcast, make sure you subscribe, give a 5-star review wherever you listen to the Booked on Rock Podcast. We're on Amazon, Apple, iHeart, Spotify, Spreaker, TuneIn, and on YouTube Music. You can check out the full episodes on video, along with video highlights from episodes on the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. Find it at Booked on Rock. Thanks again for listening. Now back to the show. As far away as Achtung Baby was from U2's 80s roots, 1993's Zooropa, featuring the singles Numb, Lemon, Stay So Far So Close, you say represented U2 pushing themselves away from that sound even further than they did on Achtung Baby. Yet the band wasn't done pushing boundaries even further. In 1997, they released Pop. In it, Bono continues to satirize the media, but more from the intersection of irony and celebrity culture. You write in the book, quote, making music influenced by what was happening in dance clubs. Pop also lyrically lampoons the culture by holding a mirror to its face. Discotheque, Staring at the Sun, Last Night on Earth, Please, If God Will Send His Angels, and Mofo. Those are all the singles. A lot of singles released. And it initially received favorable reviews from critics. It reached number 1 in 35 countries, including the UK and the US. So the numbers are great. However, the album's lifetime sales are among the lowest in U2's catalog, and it received only a single platinum certification. We talked about how the way the band was perceived by the end of the 80s and how it influenced where they went to start the 90s. Where is the band at in the aftermath of Pop and the massive Zoo TV tour?
So just as Rattle and Hum saw U2 push the theme of America and American music, inspiring them as far as they could take it, so did they do the same thing with Pop. And the arrival of the 1990s was this exciting time culturally and technologically. The internet was on its way, and the Joshua Tree depicted in black and white these stone-faced men looking serious in the desert. But Achtung Baby was about turning that around in full Technicolor fanfare, and they kept pushing that throughout the 90s. And when they toured Achtung Baby for Zoo TV, they had constructed a stage that had like these giant video screens that played TV programming as a commentary on the saturation of mass media and its influence on our culture and in our environment. But by the time of Pop Mart in 1998, which was rushed by the way, that the album Pop, they didn't finish it to their liking because they had to have these touring commitments. So it was already kind of marred from the start because it wasn't fully realized. And when they started the tour, they hadn't rehearsed a lot of the songs as well as they should have. So there was a lot of problems. But by the time of Pop Mart 98, instead of a bunch of screens, it's now one giant screen flashing pop culture references like Laura Croft, the video game character. And also the band would do things like descend onto the stage riding inside a giant Maribel lemon, almost like an Andy Warhol-esque parody of mid to late 90s culture. And I don't think a lot of people understood it at the time because it seemed like the joke that had started with Achtung Baby and Zoo TV just started to go on for too long. And again, just like with the 80s, them becoming now this showboat American band, they're nearly becoming caricatures of what they were. And since then, over the last 30 years, pop has seen a more positive reevaluation. And I think there are a lot of great things from that part of their career, even if it does at times seem like, okay, fellas, we get it. But, if they do a kind of release with some extra material from that, I would be really interested in that. Or even just like, here's how we originally wanted pop to be if we had the time to do it.
Yeah, and I don't think they play any songs off of that album on tour live.
Not really, no.
No.
I mean, Staring at the Sun, perhaps, but not a lot of them.
Yeah, which is more like their previous work, so it makes sense that they would do that. But I think the album's got some good moments on it as a whole. Not a huge fan, but boy, there's some songs on there I really love. So I guess if you're a U2 fan, you can find something in every album. But moving on now to late October 2000, All That You Can't Leave Behind was released. The lead single, Beautiful Day, it has Stuck in a Moment You Can't Get Out of, Elevation, and Walk On. All hit singles. They repositioned themselves in mainstream music culture. U2 known for taking risks, but here they proved they knew when it was time to get the train back on the tracks. I mean, how do you feel about this move by the band? I mean, if they recorded another album like Pop, it did. I don't know if they could have recovered from it.
So how do I feel about it? I'm a little biased about this because this is my first U2 CD. I bought this at 13 and I bought it in Ireland. I bought it in Waterford, Ireland on vacation to visit my family because at 13, Beautiful Day was big. Elevation, which had this cool kind of harder rock remix for the Tomb Raider movie. I mean, that was just perfect for me. And I think I was aware of U2 other than that, but so I was like going to buy my first U2 CD, it was that one. So it has a special place in my heart. But looking back on it over the last 25 years, it's an album that typically gets thought of as U2 returning back to basics, but I don't think that's an accurate way to see it. It does represent them moving on and adjusting to the culture as it was at that time. And certainly there are some tracks where you can hear pop's lingering electronic influences. Certainly the opening of Beautiful Day, you have a couple like little tonal notes of that electronic work. And even the track New York, which is heavily electronic, does, really showcases that. But the album does things on its own that the earlier albums do not. You could argue that they didn't take as many risks as they had with earlier albums, but the very idea that they were trying to hone a more contemporary and a more adult sound that, is coming with them being men getting older, while not straying too far from the core of their band, I think is a type of risk. They certainly didn't try to do what they had already done before with that album. Yeah,
interesting point. Yeah, you right, quote, when U2 went back into the studio to record a new album in February of 2003, they wanted to continue the band-focused dynamic established during All That You Can't Leave Behind, but also focus on producing a harder rock sound while improving their songwriting. And the result would be the 2004 album, How to Dismantle an Atomic Bomb. Vertigo, Sometimes You Can't Make It on Your Own, City of Blinding Lights, and All Because of You. It's number one in 34 countries, including the U.S., 8 Grammys, but things didn't get off to a great start. The early sessions, talk about those with producer Chris Thomas, who had produced the Sex Pistols previously.
Yeah, so they wanted to get into this harder rock sound to kind of go to their roots and the music that had inspired them. So they wanted to work with Chris Thomas, who had produced the Sex Pistols, because they love the Sex Pistols and they love that album, Never Mind the Bollocks. But what ended up being How to Dismantle an Atomic Bomb is not that harder rock album. There are certainly elements of it. So they pretty much had a complete album ready to go that he produced, but they couldn't get the full band to agree on it. And one thing that sets U2 apart from a lot of other bands, and also explains why they've been together for so long, is that they only do things that the whole band agrees, and they share everything equally. And with this early version of the Atomic Bomb album, the band was split, pretty much as split as they were on the direction of Achtung Baby. Bono and the Edge liked the album, while Larry and Adam felt the songs lacked a certain something, like that oomph. They just weren't feeling that oomph. So they reached out to Steve Lillywhite, their first producer, and somebody whose opinion that they could trust. And he listened to it, and he described the album as having the weight of the world on its shoulders, but that it wasn't any fun. So they went back and worked on it, and with Steve producing the album, which he hadn't done since War 20 years earlier.
There were sessions with Rick Rubin. What were those? What's the story behind that?
I don't know a lot of details about it. There are like 2 singles, I think, that came out of that. One of them is Windows in the Sky, which appears on the U2 18 singles compilation. And I think it was just a matter of just creative differences in terms of the process. U2 is a band that likes to experiment in the studio. They don't come in with really any solid ideas. They work together until they find a groove or an idea that they like, and they flesh it out from there. From what I understand in terms of Rick Rubin as a producer and the way that he likes to work, is that he wants you to have a solid idea of what you want when you come in, and then he just takes you over the goal line. And I don't think he really meshed with their way of working. I don't think they meshed with his way of working, and just couldn't come to kind of any kind of agreement. And since over the last 20 years, they haven't released that many albums, and it's because now they're at a place in their life where they want to spend more time on something until they get it the way that they absolutely want. And I think that's a learning experience from the pop debacle. So no one's rushing you to make an album. They make whatever they want to make, good or bad, but they want people who understand that. And so that's I think that's what happened with them, was just that Rick wanted something that was more complete than they came with.
And that was around the time of Dismantle Atomic Bomb.
Yeah, a couple years after.
Okay, yeah. 2009's No Line on the Horizon has some of my favorite U2 songs, including Magnificent and I'll Go Crazy If I Don't Go Crazy Tonight. Also on there, Get on Your Boots. And I'm missing one other one, right?
Moment of Surrender. That's it. Yeah.
Moment of Surrender.
Was not a single, though.
Was not a single, but a great U2 song. Commercial success. Debuted at number 1 in 30 countries. It didn't earn the accolades and acclaim received by the previous 2 albums. Why do you think that is?
Well, predominantly the music landscape was changing. Rock, as the dominant genre in music for several decades, was losing its place in the cultural hierarchy with the rise of hip hop and rap, and the internet and the advent of streaming media was changing people's relationships with music, how they consumed it, what they had access to, more options and more availability. And while U2 were still a huge touring band, and the U2 360 tour in support of that album, that would become the highest grossing tour at that time. But U2, for many young people discovering their musical taste, as teenagers or college students at the time, U2 was their dad's favorite band. Teenagers, thanks to the internet, had more musical outlets than those did when U2 was dominating the charts in the 80s and 90s, when you had fewer options and opportunities to discover new music.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Never, ever, ever, under any circumstances, say, I'll be right back. Because you won't be back.
I'm getting another beer. You want one?
Yeah, sure.
I'll be right back.
Find the Booked on Rock website at bookedonrock.com. There you can find all the back episodes of the show, the latest episode in video and audio, links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the podcast, plus all the social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Also, check out the Booked on Rock blog, find your local independent bookstore, find out all the latest hot rock book releases. And before you go, check out the Booked on Rock online store. Pick up some Booked on Rock merch. It's all at bookedonrock.com. The music industry drastically changed. File sharing, eventually streaming services. Their 2014 album, Songs of Innocence, was released, and it was free to iTunes customers. This is a well-known story. You write, quote, though they were reportedly paid a lump sum and Apple spent $100 million on marketing for Apple Music and the album, many musicians and industry experts criticized U2 for allegedly sending a message to consumers that suggested music should be free as opposed to being purchased as someone's art and livelihood. There was also public outcry accusing Apple and U2 of adding music to people's libraries without permission, stemming from an opt-in feature on iTunes or in iTunes that automatically enabled music downloads. U2, again, known for taking risks. Some paid off, some didn't. I'm curious as to what you think about the band's decision doing that, looking back on it now 11 years later.
I think people are thinking about the wrong thing when they talk about the Apple Music fiasco with that album, because, people pro release, which are largely a lot of U2 fans, they're like, well, it's a free thing, what does it matter? And I it's whatever. I don't really think about that, but it's the other side. It's this, this side of, I didn't give permission for this music to be added to my iTunes. Okay, you sign this giant terms of agreement and usage for a proprietary platform developed on a proprietary device by one of the biggest technology companies in the world. You don't own that. Even the stuff that you purchase on their store digitally, whatever movies or TV shows or music, you really don't own that. And so I think that, people tend to forget that. This is not your music collection. It's a collection that's curated in a space that you don't own or control. And so to me, that's the larger thing. And, you too can be, the punching bags for this, all they want, but it's really the technology companies, really Apple that really should be getting the criticism. And I don't think they get the criticism enough because, that's the device I have, that's the computer I have, and I like those things. And really, so Apple spent $100 million marketing this Apple Music app, and they needed some big name to sell that. And any other artist, I think, would have had the same response, whether it be Beyonce or Taylor Swift. I think it would just been a lose-lose for the artist in general. And it still kind of coming up 11 years later, it's become the take my wife please of music journalism hacks. I saw this article somewhere on the Joshua Tree that it was like a modern review of the Joshua Tree, and it opened up with this Apple Music thing, and it was like before the Apple Music fiasco, and I'm like, what does this 2014 thing have to do with this album from the 80s? It's a very lazy way to frame it, and it's not a bad album. It's actually a pretty decent album. I mean, the album that came afterwards, Songs of Experience, is not that great of an album, but Songs of Innocence, I think, stands in the top half of their discography for sure. And some critics have lightened up a bit about that when they saw U2 play those songs for the Innocence and Experience tour in 2015, saying that the release really impacted their views of the songs initially, but when they got to see them live, got to really appreciate the songs for what they were. And so, if you stopped yourself from listening to that album because of the Apple Music thing, actually, if you're open to U2, give it a listen. And really, for as much criticism as they got for it, I think it worked in ways that aren't really obvious. Several of their albums and a compilation went back into like the top 40 on the iTunes charts, because they found people who didn't know who they were, who was willing to check them out. It was a big risk to say, look, there's, as big as U2 is, as many people like U2, there's a ton more that don't even know who U2 is. And this is a way for them to become aware. And I think just that awareness is a type of success. Was it a bad decision? I mean, I don't really know. I think bands, especially legacy bands, are struggling with how to get their music out there. Certainly like The Cure is a band that has to constantly tour, in order to be successful. So I'm a little softer on it than the critics are, but I think generally the framing is wrong. The onus needs to be on Apple and not this idea that, oh, I own my iTunes library.
Every Breaking Wave is a song that's held up very well. That's one of the best
Absolutely.
latter era U2 songs. And that does have Iris, the song Iris, about Bono's mother on there. Miracle of Joey Ramone, Song for Someone, another great one. Raised by Wolves, I was always a fan of. So definitely worth. Sleep Like a Baby Tonight is another good one. Yeah, it's definitely worth giving a listen. If there's anybody that's listening to this that kind of gave up on YouTube because of it, go and listen to that album. Now you lead chapter 5, which is titled Love is All We Have Left, with, quote, the new millennium saw U2 enter an era in which they could look back on their career while still defining it. Songs of Innocence 2014 explores the band members' adolescent years in 1970s Ireland. Songs of Experience in 2017, that gets into the more mature themes of loss and mortality. And Songs of Surrender in 2023, a collection of 40 re-recorded and reimagined songs from the band's history, reflecting on their past to understand their present and future. U2 recently had a successful residency in Las Vegas at the Sphere, which you said you were, one show did you go to?
It was the U2UV in October. I can't remember what number show it was, but yeah, it was a great experience. It was in October of 2023.
Okay, so that was towards the beginning of it, because it started in September of 2023, went to March 2024. And you write at the end of the book, quote, after 50 years performing as a band, U2 show no signs of standing still. What do you think the future holds for U2? What do you hope for?
I don't know what I'm looking forward to finding out. I don't know, but I'm looking forward to finding out what they're going to do. And I don't really have anything I'm hopeful for, but it's rather that I'm just glad they're still around doing stuff. I never really care when people tell me they don't like U2 or that they're not good anymore. It's like, who cares? The great albums are still great, and I think it's inspiring to see a group of friends still going strong after 50 years, because no other band has accomplished that. They are the longest running band with no lineup changes, and they've been smart for the most part about how they handle their legacy. And they've been an important part of my life for 25 years, and I'm very thankful to them for the music and memory of the years. And so they could do what they want, and I could choose to listen if I want. And I think that's quite a nice arrangement.
Perfectly stated. I feel the same way. I was just saying to somebody the other day, I said, some of these artists, like a U2, are ones that I'm a fan of, that I've been a fan of, that have been a part of my life, as you said. They could literally fall flat on stage, and it doesn't change what they did before. So, and everybody loves on nowadays. They go to YouTube and they like to poke fun at these artists and how they sound and how they look. And it's just, I try not to even look at the comments anymore, because once these bands are gone and these artists are gone, there never will be another like them. And U2 is absolutely just the body of work is second to none, and I'm a huge fan. So and this book here, U2 Until the End of the World, it's out October 7, you said?
That's correct.
Okay, October 7. Go out and get a copy wherever books are sold. Look for it at your nearest independent bookstore. If you want to find your nearest independent bookstore, go to bookedonrock.com. And where can people find you online, Bradley?
My website is bradley-morgan.com. You can also find me on Blue Sky and Twitter at Bradley Morgan. I'm pretty easy to find.
Awesome. Bradley, thanks again. It was great seeing you. Great to have you back on.
Really appreciate the opportunity, Eric. Thank you so much.
That's it. It's in the books.